So the first question we will address is, did Jesus resurrect from the dead? Okay, so this is a very important question that we ask, a very important question in which Christianity hinges on. Okay, resurrection is a big deal. It's a very big deal because no major religious leaders or no religious leaders have ever resurrected from the dead. Okay? It's not something that is very usual. It's a miracle. It's a big miracle, right? To resurrect from the dead. And everything on Christianity hinges on the resurrection from the dead. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 to 15. Okay, this is what Paul says. He says, "And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. And if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins." So Paul says that the whole of Christianity hinges on the resurrection. Why? Because Jesus died on the cross as our sin offering. But then he has to resurrect as our high priest to bring the blood of the sin offering to the true Holy of Holies, which is in heaven, to present his blood as the final sacrifice, right? The final atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole mankind. Okay, and because he resurrected and he succeeded in doing that, therefore, redemption plan is completed. So Christianity hinges on the resurrection. Okay, his resurrection means that he succeeded in redemption plan, and those who believe in Jesus can have eternal life through the forgiveness of sins. That is the implication. And then for the Jews, it is also the proof that he is Messiah, because the whole of the Old Testament prophesied about the coming of Messiah. And now that he has come, the Jews require a sign. What is that sign? Is that the resurrection from the dead. And next, for the whole world, Jesus' resurrection is the authoritative proof that he is the true God, on the basis that no person, no important person, right? No emperor, no kings, no religious leader in history has ever risen from the dead. In fact, about 1-2 decades ago, there was a very well-known religious leader who died, and the followers, the disciples of this religious leader, they were hoping, they were expecting him to resurrect from the dead, because it's very well known, but he did not. So of course, he was buried and so forth. Okay, so how am I going to approach this question on whether Jesus resurrected from the dead? How do we use logical reasoning? What kind of evidence do we look at to prove this? So we're going to take this approach here, which is on the screen. 7 steps, all right? 7 things we will do. 3 of it is before the event of Jesus' death and resurrection. And then we'll talk about, right in the middle, the event of his resurrection. And subsequently, 3 items where post-resurrection, okay? So it follows a sequential, logical thought. First is that we will show you that Jesus actually claimed that he would resurrect from the dead as proof that he is Messiah. Okay, which means that it is not an afterthought. Sometimes we can create a whole new religion based on an afterthought. Something happened, okay, let's create a story as an afterthought and then, promote that story. But in this case, Jesus had awareness. He had self-awareness that he came for the very purpose to die on the cross, and he has to resurrect from the dead. And because of that, because of his clear mission, he actually made the claim that he would resurrect. And this is a very powerful thing, right? When you make a claim, it's like a dare, You make a claim and then it gets fulfilled. It proves that that claim is true. Okay, so we will show you that Jesus made the claim. And number 2, we will show you that Jesus actually died on the cross. Okay, because in order to have the resurrection, first he must die, right? And the fact is that he died in full view of many witnesses on the cross because it was a public crucifixion, all right? And number 3, the body of Jesus, right, after he died, he was buried in a known location, which is very important because, if the body was not buried in a known location, it went missing, then you cannot account for this missing body. But because he was buried in a known location, okay, which was very well guarded. The fact that there is a missing body is proof that he resurrected. Okay? So next, number 4, we'll talk about the resurrection. The proof his body was not in the grave. Next, we will talk about how post-resurrection, that wasn't the end of the story. If somebody stole his body, that would be the end of the story. But post-resurrection, his disciples actually saw him, right? Many of his disciples saw him, okay, which means that he actually rose from the dead. And number 6, these disciples that saw him, they were actually cowardly before, when Jesus was sent to the cross. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. The disciples ran away. They were cowardly, but something happened. This encounter with the resurrected Christ must be real and true because it transformed these disciples from cowardly people to the disciples who would change the world, who would bring the gospel message to the ends of the earth. So there is a very compelling evidence. And finally, look, we say all these things happened 2,000 years ago. What about now, at the time that we live now? Well, if Jesus resurrected from the dead is alive, then we'll show that Christians today can still encounter the resurrected Christ. And that is a proof that he is alive. All right? So what do you think of these 7 points? Solid? Strong? Okay, good. Okay, so let's launch into it. There are many books on the resurrection. You can read Lee Strobel, Josh McDowell, and so forth, all right? Okay, so we will start with the fact that Jesus actually told his disciples that he would have to die and rise from the dead on the 3rd day. And in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus told his disciples, it was recorded at least 3 times, okay, which means that it was not an afterthought, it was not tikam, it was real. He was preparing them. 3 times it was recorded. So I will share with you the passages on the 1st and the 3rd time. Okay. So the first time Jesus told his disciples, Luke 9, verses 21 to 22. Okay, he says, and he strictly warned and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man, right, that's his title, the Son of Man, that's how he addresses himself, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the 3rd day. So he told his disciples exactly what must happen, right? He must suffer, he must be rejected, he must be killed, and then be raised on the 3rd day. So this is Luke chapter 9, right? So now we fast forward to the 3rd time where Jesus told his disciples, and this is Luke 18, verses 31 to 33, at least the 3rd time where it was recorded. And he took the 12 aside and said to them, behold, we are going to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the spiritual capital. It is the place where he would be crucified. So Jesus went to Jerusalem on a mission, knowing that he would die. And he says, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. Remember last Saturday we talked about prophecies as evidence and how the prophecies were fulfilled. So when Jesus goes into Jerusalem, all these prophecies predicted or prophesied by prophets 800 years before, 700 years before, 500 years before, hundreds of years before, right? It will all be fulfilled. Verse 32, for he will be delivered to the Gentiles and will be mocked and insulted and spit upon. They will scourge him and kill him, and the 3rd day he will rise again. So it's very consistent. Jesus had the awareness that he came to die, but he will have to rise again on the 3rd day. Okay, so he kept saying it, he predicted it, and at least 3 times it was recorded. It was not an afterthought, it was a mission. Next, Jesus also said that his resurrection is the sign that he is the Messiah, prophesied in the Old Testament. The proof, the sign he will give is that he will resurrect from the dead. So in John chapter 2, verses 18 to 19, the Jews said, what sign do you show us since you do these things? The Jews asked for a sign. Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple," referring to his own body, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." So Jesus said, destroy this temple, which is his body, and he will resurrect on the third day. Of course, the Jews misunderstood him, right? Later, they thought he was talking about this destruction of the physical temple and so forth. So when Jesus went on trial, in Matthew 26, verses 60 to 61, the religious leaders who were jealous of Jesus and wanted to crucify him because they thought he was a false prophet, they rounded up 2 false witnesses. And what was their accusation against Jesus based on the words that they took out of context that Jesus said earlier? Verse 60. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." I mean, the temple of God, the temple of Herod, right? It took years, right? It was built and then Herod improved on it. It took years. So they were saying that this guy, he must be a false prophet because he's claiming that he will destroy this temple and raise it up, build it in 3 days. Okay, I need some help for level 3. Okay, next, when Jesus was being crucified on the cross, there were 3 people, right? Jesus was at the center. There were 2 other people being crucified on the left and on the right. Okay, and in Matthew 27, verse 40, right? And the people were mocking him, right? The people were watching him. They were mocking him, saying all kinds of things. And one of the mockery that they said to him was, in verse 40, "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So do you see? 3 times, at least, that this issue of the resurrection is repeated. Okay? Or at least Jesus' claim, which was taken out of context, and he was mocked for it. Okay, so everything hinges on the resurrection. So this next, okay, we jump to number 2 now. I'm going to show you that Jesus actually died on the cross. Okay, don't worry about that. It's small, but just listen to me. Okay. Now, some people claim that Jesus didn't die on the cross. It only appeared so. But they offer no proof for that claim, right? So, we will get into the details to show that Jesus actually died on the cross. Now, there were 3 things that happened, right, that would have killed Jesus. If the first thing didn't kill him, the second thing would. If the second thing didn't, the third thing would, right? There were 3 things. The first is, before Jesus went and was hung on the cross, he was scourged, meaning that he was whipped, okay? He was whipped with the Roman whip, which is called the flagrum. And this Roman whip is not those that, you buy as a toy or whatever, right? This is a real, serious, lethal whip, okay? It was designed to torture and to kill. So the Roman scourging normally consisted 39 lashes, but it could have been more. The whip called the flagrum consisted of braided leather tongs with metal balls and pieces of sharp bone woven into or intertwined with the braids. The balls added weight to the whip, causing deep bruising as the victim was struck. The pieces of bone served to cut into the flesh. The resulting cuts were so severe that the skeletal muscles, underlying veins, sinews, and bowels of victims were exposed. This beating was so severe that at times, victims would not survive it in order to go on to be crucified. Okay, so on the right-hand side at the top, there is the Roman flagrum. It's a little small, but you can just imagine, right? Somebody being whipped with this kind of whip, with all these items woven into the braids and so forth. Okay, so it is painful. It is, it can cause great harm to a person. But Jesus did not die as a result of the scourging. It may have contributed later as he was hung on a cross to his death due to the bleeding, but it did not kill him. Number 2, the crucifixion on the cross, the process where Jesus was nailed to the cross and hung for hours. And the Bible tells us that Jesus actually died, at the second phase where he was hung on the cross. There is evidence from Scripture that Jesus experienced hypovolemic shock due to excessive loss of blood and fluids as a result of being flogged. As Jesus carried his own cross to Golgotha, he collapsed, and a man named Simon was forced to either carry the cross or help Jesus carry the cross the rest of the way to the hill. The collapse indicates Jesus had low blood pressure. Another indicator that Jesus suffered from hypovolemic shock was that he declared he was thirsty as he hung on the cross, indicating his body's desire to replenish fluids. Next, let's talk about another thing that happened physically, right? It's something called asphyxiation, all right? Can Sally help me? Is that pronunciation correct? Asphyxiation, okay. The state or process of being deprived of oxygen, which can result in unconsciousness or death. So this happened as Jesus was hung on the cross. The weight of his body pulled down on the diaphragm, and the air moves into his lungs and remains there. Jesus must push up on his nailed feet, causing more pain, right, in order to exhale. The difficulty surrounding exhalation leads to a slow form of suffocation, which would eventually lead to death. So, this is what happened to Jesus as he hung on the cross for hours. He suffered from asphyxiation. And the third thing, for the rare ones who survive the first and the second stage, then the third stage will ensure that they will surely die. Okay? And at the third stage, they will be speared through the side with a Roman spear, right? That will go through the lungs and the heart. John 19, verses 33 to 34. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. So something very interesting here, right? We say that the Bible is recorded by eyewitnesses. Okay, and these eyewitnesses are not doctors. They are not, they are just maybe fishermen. They are, eyewitnesses. So as they record, they say the spear, as it pierced his side, what came out? Blood and water. So we always wonder, why water? Should be just blood, right? Why water? Okay. So now with medical knowledge, we understand why. Okay, so when he was speared through his side, the spear pierced through his lungs and the heart. So anyone who was not dead would definitely die through that process. So Jesus likely died by hypovolemic shock and asphyxiation. But, even if anyone doubted that he actually died, the spear would definitely confirm that he would have died, all right? But he died, based on the Bible, he died even before the spear. So prior to death, he sustained rapid heartbeat caused by hypovolemic shock, okay, which also causes fluid to gather in the sac around the heart and the lungs. Okay, so fluid gathered. This gathering of fluid in the membrane around the heart is called pericardial effusion. And the fluid gathering around the lungs is called pleural effusion. Correct, huh? Pleural effusion. This explains why after Jesus died and the Roman soldier thrust a spear through Jesus' side, piercing both lungs and the heart, blood and water came from his side. So isn't this amazing? The Bible records it as it is. The eyewitness may not even have understood why there was water, but today with science we understand why there was water together with the blood. And based on the Journal of American Medical Association, which was published in March 1986, it says, modern doctors attest that the weight of historical and medical indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports a traditional view that the spear thrust between his right rib probably perforated not only the right lung but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So here is the quote from the Journal of American Medical Association. Jesus died on the cross. We move on to point 3. Jesus was buried. Jesus was buried in a tomb cut out of rock. And the people, the Jews, his disciples, and the Romans all knew where his grave was. Okay, so if you look at the picture there, it was a tomb cut out from rock, and then you have another rock that was rolled over to cover the entrance. Okay, so this is a tomb for rich people. So in Mark 15:43-47, it tells us that the certain Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, the Sanhedrin council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. So Joseph placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. So this tomb, belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, probably a rich man who was on the council, and then he asked for the body of Jesus and placed him in this tomb. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. So we have quite a few people who knew where he was laid, okay? I believe there were, everybody was public knowledge. So you've got Joseph of Arimathea, you've got Mary Magdalene, you've got Mary, the mother of Joseph, and later you find that the whole tomb was guarded. So the Romans knew where he was laid. So there's no question about, we just lost his body, we don't know where he went to. They knew exactly which tomb his body was laid. And next, the fact is that the tomb was securely guarded. And in those days, negligent guards would be put to death. If they didn't guard properly, they fell asleep, then the body was stolen, they would die. So obviously, it's a very serious thing to lose, okay, to fall asleep. So, okay, it is not possible for the cowardly disciples. We say, wow, his disciples came, fought with the Roman soldiers and beat them up and took the body away. So heroic. No, guess what? They all ran away. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. His disciples ran away. They were cowardly. They were in fear. If they did not fight for Jesus when he was alive, why would they come to fight for this body, right, when he was dead? So it was not possible that the cowardly disciples who fled when Jesus was alive to fight for a lost cause when Jesus is dead. Okay, and next, let's talk about Jesus' burial, okay, and the guards and so forth. Matthew 27, verse 62-66. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was alive how the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.'" So they remember, right? "After 3 days I will rise. Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' So the last deception will be worse than the first." So Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go your way. Make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. So guess what? It was heavily guarded by strong Roman soldiers. And of course, and that heavy stone was rolled over the entrance. They anticipated, they were afraid his body would be stolen. They took all the precautions. How can 12 fishermen, fight against 12, a number of all the guards, right? These were the guards who were armed. Okay, so there's a picture there just to give an illustration. So what happened was, On the third day, Jesus resurrected. The angel came, the guards ran away, and the stone was rolled away, and Jesus rose from the dead. In Matthew 28, verses 1 to 7, it says, "Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb," because they knew where the tomb was, right? "But the angel answered and said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, as he had said. Come see the place where the Lord lay.'" So the bottom right picture, on the rock where the body was laid, there was no body there. Okay? "And go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead." So interestingly, based on the eyewitness account, the empty tomb was first discovered by women. And this account is a truthful account because of the criterion of embarrassment. Okay, if somebody wanted to cook this up, they would never say that the two women were the first witnesses to see the empty tomb. They would have said, "Oh, somebody who is very reputable," or whatever. But the Bible records it as it is. Truthful eyewitness accounts. Two women saw that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. And next, the empty tomb was also confirmed by the enemies of Jesus. So not only his disciples said it, but now even his enemies, the people who wanted him crucified, the Romans, they all said it as well. So the enemy acknowledged that the body was missing and had no explanation for it. So they created a false report that was common at the time of the writing of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew 28, verses 11 to 15. "Now while they were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, 'Tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears,'" Governor Pilate, "'we will appease him and make you secure.' So they took the money and did as they were instructed. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day." Meaning that at the time of the writing of the book of the Gospel of Matthew, that was still the common story going around, that the body was stolen. So if the claim of the resurrection was false, the authorities could have easily stopped the false rumors by opening the grave to show that the body was still there. Correct? You need to dispel false rumors, right? Very easy to dispel, right? Just roll open, show everybody, bring the reporters, Jerusalem Times, whatever, bring them, take photo, yes, the body is here. But the body wasn't there. That's why they couldn't do it. And apart from the resurrection, there is no alternative explanation on why the tomb was empty. So this is proof, okay, additional proof of the resurrection. So what happens after the resurrection? That is very important, right? If nothing happens after the resurrection, maybe for some reason this body was stolen or whatever. Maybe it decomposed in 3 days or whatever, right? I mean, you can cook up some story. But guess what? A lot of things happen after the resurrection. Jesus was seen by his disciples. Okay, so the risen Christ was seen by many disciples and groups of disciples over a long period of 40 days as the infallible proof that he had resurrected. Acts chapter 1 verse 3, it says, "To whom he also presented himself alive after suffering by many infallible proofs." After his suffering, right? He presented himself alive by many infallible proofs, being seen by them, his disciples, during the 40 days, speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God. Okay, so Luke, who is the author of the book of Acts, says this. And then in John chapter 20, verses 24 to 28, this is the account of Thomas. Thomas the doubter, the guy one of the 12, right, who doubted Jesus. He had no faith, he doubted. He says, so he, Thomas, said to them, unless I see his hand, and I see the print of it, the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hands into his side, I will not believe. Then he, Jesus, said to Thomas, reach out your finger here, and look at my hands. And reach your hands here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. So Thomas saw the risen Christ. He put his fingers into his pierced hands and his pierced side. Okay, and he acknowledged that this is my Lord and my God, the risen Christ. And next, there was a creed at the point of Paul's writing of the book of Corinthians that had been passed down, a creed that was passed down by the earliest disciples, passed down over probably a few decades. Okay, and this creed talked about the resurrection of Jesus, and this creed was never challenged, even though the people whom the creed talks about some of them were still alive in those days. That means nobody ever challenged that this creed was false or whatever, right? They all took it to be true because it was true. So this is a creed of Jesus' resurrection, and it was then taken and written into the book of Corinthians. Okay, so the creed of Jesus' resurrection had been passed down in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, but no one disputed it. If the creed was false, many of the 500 who were still alive would have disputed it. So which means that this is evidence that Jesus' resurrection is true. So 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, Paul talks about the creed. He says, for I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received. Okay, he heard about this creed, he received it. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, another name for Peter. He was seen by Peter and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once. 500 believers. Okay, a large gathering of people, right? They saw Jesus. And he says, of whom the greater part remain to the present. That means this was some time ago, but majority of these 500 were still alive at the point where Paul was writing this. Okay, but he says, but some have fallen asleep, some have died. Okay, but of course, those who were alive, if this creed was false, they would have said, no, I was there, I didn't see Jesus. But nobody disputed it. That means it's very strong proof that Jesus rose from the dead and he was seen by 500 people at the same time. Verse 7, after that he was seen by James. James is the brother of Jesus. I'll talk more about this later. And then by all the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me, Paul. Right on the road to Damascus, he encountered the living Christ. So this creed is a powerful evidence of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Some people then say, wait a minute, maybe this was hallucination, right? The 500 people hallucinated that they saw Jesus even though they didn't. Possible? What do you think? Is it possible for 500 people to hallucinate the same thing? Is it possible for 500 people to have the same dream at night? No, right? So hallucination has to do with substance abuse or mental illness. Hallucination is based on unique individual experiences. Even if 500 people had hallucination, they could hallucinate on different things, not on the same thing. So being seen by 500 people, right? And with neither substance abuse nor mental illness, okay, it only proves that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Okay, that they saw the resurrected Christ. And next, the Gospels are honest eyewitness accounts. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Okay, these are all honest eyewitness accounts. It's based on eyewitness accounts. Because the early apostles, disciples, they were called witnesses, right? Be witnesses to me, right? Witness is to say what you saw. So Jesus called them to be truthful witnesses of what they had seen. Jesus called his disciples in Luke 24, 46 to 48. Then he said to them, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day. And you are witnesses of all these things." You've seen it with your own eyes. You can say what you saw. You can tell people what you saw. You can write down what you saw. You are witnesses. Be truthful witnesses. So the 4 Gospels are honest eyewitness accounts that tells us about the life, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. The first Gospel of Matthew was written by his disciple, Matthew, the tax collector. The second Gospel of Mark was written by the disciple of Peter, and he was writing with the accounts of Peter. The third Gospel written by Luke, and Luke was a historian who was very careful. He was both a doctor and a historian. He was very careful. He interviewed many people, many eyewitnesses. So he was a faithful account of all the eyewitnesses whom he had interviewed. And John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, right? A close disciple of Jesus. He wrote the Gospel of John. So you can rely on the 4 Gospels as eyewitness accounts. And all 4 of the Gospels talk about the resurrection of Jesus. And here it is, when Peter preached the Gospel and the resurrection of Christ, and when the religious leaders who crucified Jesus now comes after Peter, and they flog him and they warn him to stop speaking in the name of Jesus, to stop talking about all these things. What did Peter say? Peter said in Acts 3 verses 14 to 15. He challenged the religious leaders. He said, "But you denied the Holy One and the just, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you." The murderer, Barnabas, right? Who was set free, and Jesus was crucified. "And you killed the Prince of Life, whom God raised from the dead, of which we are witnesses." We saw it. We saw the risen Christ. We are witnesses. So Peter is talking about the fact that he is a witness to the resurrection, to the resurrected Christ. So do you see, it's eyewitness accounts. And here is a quote from William Lane Craig. "The Gospels were written in such temporal and geographical proximity to the events. They record that it would have, the Gospels were written in such temporal and geographical proximity to the events they record that it would have been almost impossible to fabricate events. Anyone who cared to could have checked out the accuracy of what they had reported. The fact that the disciples were able to proclaim the resurrection in Jerusalem in the face of the enemies a few weeks after the crucifixion shows that what they proclaimed was true, for they could never have proclaimed the resurrection under such circumstances had it not occurred." So this quote is basically saying that the Gospels were written in such, temporal means time, time and geographical proximity, very close to the events, and physically, geographically very close to the events. You cannot fabricate it because they were proclaiming this message in the face of the enemies. And if this was false, fabricated, the enemies would have come after them and everything would have been put down. But obviously this was true. That's why they couldn't put it down. And there were too many eyewitnesses. You can't put down everybody. Too many people had seen the risen Christ. What else happened? Next, the disciples of Jesus who saw the resurrected Christ were transformed. They became challenged, transformed into a different person, and they changed the world. Now remember, when Jesus was first caught, his disciples forsook him and fled. They all ran away. And then, during Jesus' trial, Peter denied Jesus 3 times out of fear for his own life. But now Peter is transformed after seeing the risen Christ. And he testifies boldly. So when he was told to shut up, stop talking about Jesus, now in Acts 5:27 to 32, okay, starting from verse 29 here, it says, "But Peter and the other disciples answered and said, 'We ought to obey God than man. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on a tree,'" which is the cross, "and we are witnesses to these things." Okay, so this is Peter and the other disciples speaking up, and they answered. And again they say, "We're not afraid of you guys. We will obey God rather than you guys." Right? Even if you kill us, we don't care. Because this was true, and we have to tell the truth based on what we had witnessed. So that was the courage that came out from these 12 previously fearful disciples. They became courageous. They became brave. Why? Because they knew they were speaking the truth. So my question to you is, if somebody told a lie, let's say if you told a lie, okay, for whatever reason, and you were challenged, you were caught, you were challenged, okay, or okay, not you, okay, let's say your friend told a lie, okay, but now you're trying to help your friend, right, and you're caught, and the people says, "Okay, tell me the truth, I'm going to torture you," right, they're going to take all these, I don't know what you use to electrocute you, some sharp things to poke you, or take some knife to cut you. Tell the truth. Is this true or not? If not, I cut you. Will you suffer for a lie, knowing that it's not true? Maybe you may suffer for the truth. I know for the truth, some people are scared, right? Okay, but for a lie, will anyone here suffer for a lie that is not true, that is inconsequential? Anybody? No, right? So they were willing to put down their lives, lay down their lives for Jesus, because this message of the gospel was meant for the salvation for the whole of mankind. It was a very important mission, and they did not want to fail Jesus. Okay, and they knew this was true. They would die for it. They would die for this message to go out. So Peter was martyred by crucifixion, upside down, in AD 69 under Emperor Nero, or at least that's what is the tradition is. And this Thomas, the doubting Thomas, who brought the gospel to South India, was martyred as well. And most of all the disciples were martyred, all the 12 apostles, maybe except for John, who survived, right, to write the book of Revelation. So guess what? There is no alternative explanation on how all these cowardly, fearful disciples were turned into brave, courageous martyrs. Agree? So here's a quote from John Stott. "Perhaps the transformation of the disciples of Jesus is the greatest evidence of all for the resurrection." Next, Jesus had brothers. Okay, now Jesus was born of Mary, impregnated by the power of the Spirit. So later, Mary and Joseph, they got married and they had other brothers. So they were his half-brothers, but they grew up with him. How many of you know that sometimes when you grow up with your own siblings, they grew up with you, you play masak, maybe you play marbles or what. They tend to doubt you. They tend to see you in the flesh, in the norm. Okay? So here we have a person by the name of James, who was the half-brother of Jesus. And it is difficult to believe your own brother is the Messiah, right? Having grown up together. So James did not believe, even during the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, and with all the miracles that Jesus performed, he did not believe that his brother Jesus was the Messiah. Right? John chapter 7 verse 5 says, "For even his brothers did not believe him." And there's a natural reason for it, because you grew up together, you see him in the flesh, in the natural. Okay, so among his brothers was one by the name of James, one by the name of Jude. We'll talk about these two later. So, Jesus appeared to James after his resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:7, it says, Paul says this. After that, he was seen by James and then by all the apostles. So James, the half-brother of Jesus, saw the resurrected Christ. What will happen if you see someone who had died, who is resurrected? Something will happen, right? I mean, imagine you go to a funeral, whoa, then suddenly the guy come up, all run away, right? Something happens when you see someone who has died. In this case, he saw the resurrected Christ in his glory, okay? And James believed. And later he became the leader of the Jerusalem church. Isn't it amazing? And not only James, there was another brother just now I showed you by the name of Jude. And this brother wrote the Epistle of Jude. He also became a believer of Christ. Jude 1, it says, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. There is no alternative explanation of how unbelieving siblings can be turned into leaders of the church who preach the gospel. Agree? Next, let's talk about another powerful character in the Bible. This person is Paul, but before he was known as Paul, he was known as Saul. Okay, Saul is a Hebrew name. Okay, Paul is more Greek. Okay, so Saul, a man of conviction, believed that Jesus was a fraud, so he was bent on destroying the church. And he was a man who was so determined. He went far. He used all his energy to do what he believed, follow his conviction. So in Acts 8, verses 1 to 3, it says, Now Saul was consenting to his death, the death of Stephen, the first martyr recorded in the book of Acts. And it says, At the same time, a great persecution arose against the church which was in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. I mean, think of this man, One guy, so determined, okay? He could cause a great persecution to rise up. He could capture believers, throw them into jail, persecute them. Okay? Powerful character. But something happened. Okay? This Saul, he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, which turned his life around 180 degrees. And later he became the greatest apostle who brought the gospel through his missionary journeys. So this event happened in Acts 9, verses 1 to 5. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, that means those who believe in Jesus, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Okay, so he encountered the living Christ, and he was told what he had to do. There is no alternative explanation on how the greatest enemy of the gospel could be turned into the greatest apostle. One of such great conviction who would die for the gospel. Agree? Finally, all this happened 2,000 years ago. We see the effects. Okay? We know Paul. Okay? We know through his missionary journeys, the churches were founded and the gospel has come to us. But today, 2,000 years later, Jesus is still alive and he is still working in the hearts of believers today. And there are so many testimonies. Here are just all the books, some of the books that I've read. Powerful testimonies. I love to read testimonies to see how God touches people. Okay? The book on, starting from the left, okay? Son of Hamas became a believer in Christ. Okay? He was radical. Heaven is for real, about how a child, he died, went to heaven and encountered Christ, but came back and he told his parents stories about what he had seen in heaven. Run Baby Run is about Nicky Cruz, the drug addict, who was also a gang member in New York, who killed, murdered people, was in street fights, but through David Wilkerson's ministry, received a lot. Raised from the Dead, story of someone who had died for, I believe it was 4 days, okay, but came back to tell his story. And then you have From Darkness to Glorious Light, the one on the far right, someone who lived in the jungles or the tribes of Myanmar, who had never heard the gospel but encountered Christ. And later, he was used as a great evangelist, okay, for the gospel. So amazing things, The Heavenly Man, okay, you should read it. It will move you to tears, the suffering, the persecution he went through in China, communist China, but how the Lord delivered him out from prison, high security prison, and today he's on asylum in Germany. Okay, and of course, the story of Reinhard Bonnke and Nabil Qureshi. These are just a few examples. But even here today, right, even in this church, people are experiencing God. They're experiencing His reality. We hear testimonies of life, transformations, of healings. God is at work. All right, so the evidence of Jesus' resurrection, in summary. Okay, what I've gone through, this is just a recap. Okay, first I show you that Jesus actually claimed that He would resurrect from the dead as proof that He's Messiah. And He died on the cross through the crucifixion. And He was buried in a known location. And He resurrected on the third day, which means that His body was no longer in the grave. And He was then seen by His disciples as being alive. And His disciples, who were fearful and despondent, were transformed. And 2,000 years later, today, we are still experiencing the risen Christ. So Jesus said in John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And a quote from William Lane Craig, the simple fact that the Christian fellowship founded on belief in Jesus' resurrection came into existence and flourished in the very city where He was executed and buried is powerful evidence for the historicity of the empty tomb. Okay, and I recommend for you all to watch The Case for Christ. The Case for Christ by, what's his name again? Lee Strobel, right? Okay, it's a movie, all right? He made a movie out from his own journey of researching all these things, the resurrection, the death of Christ, and so forth. A lot of information in a very entertaining way through a real-life story. Okay, so you can watch it. It's available on YouTube. All right, so with this, we finished this segment.